In a world where acts of kindness are often overshadowed by fear and hesitation, one young black boy dared to be different. Elijah wasn't a superhero, nor did he possess extraordinary strength or powers, but what he did to help a total stranger came from a heart full of courage and an unwavering belief that standing up for what's right truly matters. It was an ordinary summer afternoon in Elijah's neighborhood, a bustling, vibrant part of the city where kids played basketball on cracked courts, vendors called out their wares from the sidewalk, and the smell of grilled food lingered in the air. The streets were alive with a rhythm that Elijah had grown up with, a beat he knew by heart. He was only 12, but he had seen enough of the world to understand that life here wasn't always easy. His mom worked 2 jobs to keep their tiny apartment running, and he often helped out by running errands or watching his younger siblings. Elijah knew what it meant to struggle, but he also knew what it meant to have hope. That day, Elijah had just left the local grocery store, a brown paper bag tucked under one arm, and his backpack slung over his shoulder. The sun was high, and the heat made the sidewalk shimmer. As he walked, he hummed a tune under his breath, lost in thought about the basketball game he and his friends had planned for later. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something unusual. A man stumbling onto the sidewalk, his clothes disheveled, his face pale. He looked out of place, almost as if he didn't belong in this neighborhood. The man's eyes darted nervously, his movements erratic, and he clutched a briefcase tightly against his chest. Most people walking by either didn't notice him or pretended not to. A woman crossed the street to avoid him, while others glanced his way and quickly looked away. Elijah slowed his pace, his heart skipping a beat. Something about the man wasn't right. He wasn't just a stranger passing through. He looked scared, desperate, like he was running from something. Elijah's first instinct was to keep walking. After all, what could a kid like him do? But as he glanced back at the man, he noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. The man's eyes. They weren't just filled with fear. They were pleading. It was as if he was silently asking for help. Elijah hesitated, his mind racing. His mom had always warned him to stay out of trouble, to avoid getting involved in things that weren't his business. But something about this man's vulnerability struck a chord deep within him. Elijah had seen fear before. Kids getting bullied at school, his mom worrying about rent. But this was different. This wasn't just fear, it was desperation. Before Elijah could make up his mind, the situation escalated. A black SUV pulled up at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the bright sunlight. The man froze, his grip tightening on the briefcase. 2 men stepped out of the SUV, dressed in dark suits that made them look like they belonged in a movie. They scanned the street, their eyes sharp and calculating, and started walking toward the man. Elijah felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know who these men were or why they were after the stranger, but he could sense the danger in the air. The man with the briefcase looked around frantically, his breaths coming in short gasps. Elijah realized he was about to run, but he had nowhere to go. The men were closing in, their strides confident and purposeful. Without thinking, Elijah acted. He stepped out from the sidewalk and walked straight toward the man, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't have a plan. He just knew he couldn't stand by and do nothing. "Hey, Uncle Rob," Elijah called out, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. He waved at the man as if they knew each other. The stranger looked at him, confused at first, but Elijah gave him a subtle nod, a silent message that said, "Play along." The man hesitated for a split second before catching on. "Oh, hey, kid," he stammered, his voice shaky but loud enough for the men in suits to hear. "Good to see you." Elijah walked up to him, his expression casual, as if they were truly family. He grabbed the man's arm, acting like he was helping him stand steady. "Mom's been looking for you," Elijah said, his voice louder now. "Come on, let's get you home." The men in suits paused, their eyes narrowing as they watched the interaction. Elijah could feel their gaze burning into his back, but he kept moving. He led the man down the sidewalk, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure the men could hear it. He didn't dare look back, afraid that even a glance would give away the act. Once they turned the corner, out of sight from the SUV, the man stumbled and leaned against the wall, his breath ragged. "Kid," he said, his voice hoarse, "I don't know who you are, but thank you." Elijah shook his head, his own breath coming in short gasps. "Who were those guys? Why were they after you?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting around as if he expected the men in suits to appear at any moment. It's complicated," he said finally. "I can't explain right now, but you just saved my life." Elijah frowned, his curiosity growing. "What's in the briefcase?" he asked, nodding toward the object the man was clutching so tightly. The man stiffened, his grip on the briefcase tightening. "It's better if you don't know," he said, his voice low. "Trust me, kid. The less you know, the safer you'll be. Elijah wanted to press him for answers, but he could see the fear in the man's eyes. Whoever this stranger was, he was in serious trouble, and Elijah wasn't sure he wanted to get dragged into it. Still, he couldn't just walk away. "Do you have somewhere to go, somewhere safe?" Elijah asked. The man hesitated, then shook his head. "No, they'll find me no matter where I go." Elijah bit his lip, his mind racing. He didn't know this man, didn't know what he was involved in, but something told him that leaving him alone wasn't an option. He thought about his mom and how she'd react if she found out he was helping a stranger with a shady briefcase, but he also thought about what it meant to do the right thing, even when it was hard. "Come with me," Elijah said finally. "I know a place where you can hide." The man looked at him, surprised. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Elijah shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Because it's the right thing to do." As they started walking, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something much bigger than himself. He didn't know who the man was, why those guys were after him, or what was in the briefcase. But one thing was clear, this was only the beginning of a story that would change everything. What Elijah didn't realize was that his act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would uncover a truth so shocking, it would shake the entire community to its core. But for now, all he could do was keep walking, one step at a time, and hope that he was doing the right thing. Elijah led the man, who introduced himself as Mr. Carter, through the maze of narrow streets and alleyways that made up his neighborhood. The area wasn't glamorous, but it was a place where Elijah felt safe, where he knew every shortcut and hiding spot. He hoped that familiarity would buy them some time and keep them out of sight from the men in suits. They finally stopped behind an old community center that had been abandoned for years. The building's once bright paint was now peeling, and the windows were boarded up. Elijah had discovered the place years ago when he and his friends were looking for somewhere to hang out. It wasn't much, but it was quiet and hidden, the perfect place to lay low. "This should be safe for now," Elijah said, pushing open a loose board to create an entrance. He gestured for Mr. Carter to follow him inside. The air inside was stale, filled with the faint scent of dust and wood. Sunlight streamed through the cracks in the boards, creating thin beams that illuminated the otherwise dim room. Elijah watched as Mr. Carter slumped against the wall, his face pale and his breathing still uneven. "You okay?" Elijah asked, setting down his grocery bag. "You don't look so good." Mr. Carter nodded weakly. "I'll be fine. I didn't expect anyone to help me, let alone a kid." Elijah crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "Well, I couldn't just let those guys grab you. They looked dangerous. Who were they anyway?" Mr. Carter hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the briefcase he still clutched tightly. "It's complicated," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You keep saying that," Elijah said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "But I think I deserve an explanation. I just put myself in danger for you, and I don't even know why." Mr. Carter sighed, rubbing his temples as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "You're right. You do deserve to know, but I need you to promise me something first." "What?" Elijah asked, narrowing his eyes. "Promise me that you'll keep this to yourself," Mr. Carter said, his voice firm. "No matter what happens, no matter who asks, you can't tell anyone what I'm about to say." Elijah hesitated. He wasn't sure if he could make a promise like that, especially when he had no idea what kind of trouble Mr. Carter was in. But something in the man's eyes, something desperate and sincere, made him nod. "Okay," Elijah said, "I promise." Mr. Carter took a deep breath as if preparing himself. "The men you saw earlier, they work for someone very powerful, someone who doesn't like loose ends, and unfortunately I became a loose end." "What do you mean?" Elijah asked, his curiosity piqued. "I used to work for a corporation," Mr. Carter explained. "A big one. They deal in pharmaceuticals, but not the kind you'd find at your local drugstore. They were working on something dangerous, and when I found out, I couldn't stay silent." Elijah frowned, trying to process what he was hearing. "What kind of dangerous?" Mr. Carter glanced at the briefcase, his grip tightening. "They were developing a drug that could alter someone's memory, not just erase it, but rewrite it. They called it Project Genesis. At first it sounded like something that could help people, patients with trauma, soldiers with PTSD, but then I found out what they really wanted to use it for." Elijah leaned in, his heart pounding. "What?" Mr. Carter's voice dropped to a whisper. "They wanted to use it as a weapon. Imagine being able to erase someone's identity, to make them forget who they are, what they've done, even who they love. It's more than dangerous. It's terrifying." Elijah felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't imagine something like that, something so invasive and cruel. "And you, what? You tried to stop them?" Mr. Carter nodded. I gathered as much evidence as I could. Documents, emails, even video footage. Everything that proves what they're doing. It's all in here. He held up the briefcase. I was going to take it to a journalist I trust, someone who could expose them to the world, but they found out before I could get there. Now they're hunting me down, and if they catch me... He trailed off, but Elijah didn't need him to finish the sentence. The gravity of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about helping a stranger. This was about protecting the truth, about standing up to something much bigger than either of them. You're telling me those guys in suits are after you because of this? Elijah asked, pointing to the briefcase. Mr. Carter nodded. They'll do anything to protect their secrets, even if it means silencing me permanently. And now, because you helped me, they might come after you too. Elijah swallowed hard. The thought of being targeted by dangerous people made his stomach churn, but he couldn't let fear take over. So what do we do now? He asked. Mr. Carter looked at him, a hint of admiration in his eyes. Kid, you've already done more than enough. You shouldn't even be here. Elijah shook his head. I'm not just gonna leave you. If what you're saying is true, then someone has to help you. And it looks like I'm all you've got. Mr. Carter stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to argue. Finally, he sighed and nodded. All right, but if we're going to get out of this, we need a plan. As they sat in the dimly lit room, brainstorming their next move, Elijah couldn't help but feel the weight of what he had gotten himself into. He was just a kid, but now he was part of something much bigger, something that could change everything. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, but he couldn't turn back now. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Elijah realized that this was just the beginning. Whatever came next, he would face it head on. For Mr. Carter, for the truth, and for the chance to make a difference. The room grew darker as evening set in, casting long shadows across the abandoned community center. Elijah sat across from Mr. Carter, the air heavy with tension. The briefcase sat between them on the rickety table, its unassuming exterior belying the powerful secrets it held. Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a thin line between survival and disaster. What's the plan now? Elijah finally asked, his voice steady but low. Mr. Carter rubbed his temples, his exhaustion evident. We need to get this briefcase to someone who can make a difference. Her name's Sandra. She's a journalist, and she's been trying to expose the people behind this for years, but getting it to her won't be easy. Elijah frowned. Why not just go to her directly? They'll be watching her, every move, every visitor. If they catch sight of me or the briefcase, it's over, Mr. Carter explained. And now that you're involved, we need to be even more careful. Elijah felt a pang of fear but pushed it aside. What if I take it to her? They're not looking for a kid. Mr. Carter's eyes widened. No way! You've already done too much. This is dangerous, Elijah. But they don't know me, Elijah argued. You said it yourself. They'll be watching for you, not me. I can do it. The resolve in Elijah's voice left Mr. Carter silent for a moment. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. If we're going to do this, we'll need a solid plan. The next morning, the two set out, the city's bustle providing a perfect cover for their movements. Elijah carried the briefcase in a battered backpack, blending in among students and commuters. They started with a route through a busy train station, aiming to throw off anyone who might be tailing them. Stay close, but not too close, Mr. Carter instructed. We need to look like we're not together. Elijah weaved through the crowd, his heart pounding. Every glance over his shoulder felt like a confirmation of danger. He spotted a man in a dark suit lingering near the ticket counters, scanning the crowd with calculated precision. Elijah's stomach twisted. This was no ordinary commuter. He whispered into his phone's earpiece, a last-minute addition to their plan. There's someone here, near the ticket counters. Mr. Carter's voice came through calmly. Don't look directly. Head toward the east exit. I'll meet you there. Elijah adjusted his path, his fingers tightening around the backpack straps. He walked past kiosks and throngs of travelers, forcing himself to look casual. The man in the suit didn't follow immediately, but Elijah could feel the weight of eyes on him. At the east exit, Mr. Carter waited near a food cart. You see anyone? He asked as Elijah approached. Not sure, but I think they're around, Elijah replied. What now? Mr. Carter scanned the area, then pointed toward a maintenance door near a janitor's cart. We'll take the service tunnels. It's not the most glamorous route, but it'll keep us out of sight. They slipped through the door into a dimly lit corridor. The sound of their footsteps echoed eerily, the air cool and damp. Elijah couldn't help but feel like they were walking into a trap, but he trusted Mr. Carter's instincts. Halfway through the tunnel, they heard it, faint footsteps echoing behind them. They're here. Elijah whispered, his voice tight with fear. Mr. Carter nodded grimly. Pick up the pace, we're almost there. The door at the end of the tunnel opened to a small alleyway. The sunlight was blinding after the dark corridor, but there was no time to adjust. Elijah followed Mr. Carter down the alley, their footsteps quick and uneven. Behind them, the footsteps grew louder. Keep moving, Mr. Carter urged. Don't look back. As they emerged onto a bustling street, Elijah spotted a group of street performers setting up a vibrant display with drums and costumes. An idea struck him. Wait, Elijah said, pulling Mr. Carter toward the performers. Let's blend in here for a second. The performers, sensing the urgency, nodded without question. One handed Elijah a drum, and another offered Mr. Carter a bright scarf. They joined the circle, clapping along to the beat as if they belonged. The sudden burst of music and energy created enough of a distraction to mask their presence. From the corner of his eye, Elijah saw one of the men in suits emerge from the alley, scanning the street. The man hesitated, clearly thrown off by the noise and commotion. He moved on, disappearing into the crowd. Elijah let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It worked, he said, relief washing over him. Mr. Carter nodded, a rare smile breaking through his tension. You've got quick thinking, kid. After parting ways with the performers, they found refuge in a quiet park. Elijah slumped onto a bench, his heart still racing. The briefcase felt heavier than ever in his backpack, but he was more determined than ever to see their mission through. What's next? Elijah asked, looking at Mr. Carter. We're close, Mr. Carter said, his voice steady. Sandra's location isn't far from here. If we're careful, we can make it. Elijah nodded, determination gleaming in his eyes. Let's finish this. The stakes were higher than ever, but Elijah knew one thing for sure. They weren't turning back. Elijah and Mr. Carter approached the quiet cafe where Sandra, the investigative journalist, was waiting. The air was thick with tension as they moved through the streets, their footsteps quick but cautious. The cafe itself was unassuming, nestled between a bakery and a small bookstore. It was the kind of place that blended into the background, perfect for a discreet meeting. Inside, Sandra sat in a corner booth, her laptop open and a coffee cup in hand. She looked up as they entered, her sharp eyes scanning them before giving a slight nod. Elijah noticed her calm demeanor and immediately felt a bit more at ease. This was someone who had clearly been through high-stakes situations before. You must be Mr. Carter, Sandra said, standing to shake his hand. Her gaze shifted to Elijah, and her expression softened. And you're the young man who's been helping. Thank you for your courage. Elijah shrugged, trying to downplay his role. I just wanted to help. Sandra's lips curved into a small smile. Sometimes that's all it takes to make a difference. The three of them huddled together in the corner booth as Mr. Carter placed the briefcase on the table. Sandra leaned in, her fingers lightly brushing the lock before she opened it. Elijah watched as her face turned grave while she sifted through the documents inside. This is bigger than I imagined, Sandra murmured, her voice barely audible. She glanced at Mr. Carter. Where did you get all of this? Mr. Carter hesitated. It was left to me by a former colleague, someone who couldn't live with the guilt anymore. These documents expose corruption at the highest levels. Politicians, corporations, law enforcement, they're all in on it. Elijah's stomach churned. He had known this was serious, but hearing it laid out like this made the weight of the situation hit him even harder. What happens now? He asked, his voice steady despite the fear creeping in. Sandra looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. We publish it, but we need to do it carefully. If the people involved find out we're coming for them, they'll do whatever it takes to stop us. Elijah swallowed hard. You mean they'd come after us? Sandra nodded grimly. Yes, but that's why we need to act fast. For the next hour, the cafe became their makeshift headquarters. Sandra scanned and uploaded the documents to an encrypted server while Mr. Carter provided context for each file. Elijah, feeling slightly out of his depth, kept watch, his eyes darting to the cafe windows every few minutes. As they worked, Sandra's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her face tightening. They know something's up, she said. A source just warned me that certain people are starting to panic. We're running out of time. Mr. Carter leaned back, his expression tense. We need to move. If they know we're onto them, they'll try to shut this down before it goes public. Sandra nodded, packing up her laptop and the briefcase. Elijah, I know you've already done so much, but I need to ask one more thing. Can you help me get this to a secure location? Elijah didn't hesitate. Of course. The three of them left the cafe, blending into the evening crowd. Sandra led the way, her brisk pace signaling the urgency of the situation. They moved through back alleys and side streets, avoiding main roads to stay out of sight. Every shadow felt like a potential threat, and Elijah's heart raced with every step. Finally, they arrived at a small office building. Sandra unlocked the door, and they slipped inside. The room was dimly lit, with rows of computers and monitors lining the walls. A few other journalists were already there, their faces focused and serious. "This is where we'll finish it," Sandra said. "Once we publish the story, the truth will be out there for everyone to see. They won't be able to hide anymore." Elijah nodded, feeling a mix of fear and pride. He had stumbled into this by chance, but now he was part of something much bigger than himself. As the team worked to finalize the story, Sandra turned to Elijah. "You know, it's not often you see someone your age show this kind of bravery. Most people would have walked away." Elijah shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "My mom always said you should do what's right, even if it's hard." Sandra's expression softened. "She raised you well." The night stretched on as they worked tirelessly, their determination unshaken. By dawn, the story was ready to go live. Sandra looked at Mr. Carter and Elijah, her finger hovering over the publish button. "This is it," she said. "Once I press this, there's no going back." Mr. Carter nodded. "Do it." Elijah held his breath as Sandra pressed the button. The room was silent for a moment before the monitors lit up with notifications. The story was out, and the world was about to learn the truth. In the days that followed, the fallout was monumental. The story made headlines worldwide, sparking investigations and protests. Elijah watched it all unfold, amazed that his small act of kindness had set off such a chain reaction. But it wasn't without its challenges. There were threats, moments of doubt, and constant vigilance. Yet through it all, Elijah knew they had done the right thing. One evening, as he sat with Mr. Carter and Sandra, Elijah reflected on everything that had happened. "Do you think it was worth it?" he asked. Sandra smiled, her eyes full of hope. "Absolutely. The truth is always worth it." Elijah nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. He had stood up for what was right, and though the road had been difficult, he wouldn't have done it any other way. The world had changed because of them, and Elijah knew that sometimes all it took was one person to make a difference. In the aftermath of the story going public, the world seemed to erupt. News outlets replayed the revelations nonstop, each report peeling back layers of corruption that had been hidden for decades. Protests broke out in major cities as people demanded accountability. Social media was flooded with hashtags calling for justice, and Elijah watched it all unfold with a mix of awe and unease. While he felt proud of what they had accomplished, the ripple effects were far more intense than he had imagined. It wasn't just about the truth being exposed, it was about the people affected, both those who had suffered in silence and those whose lives were now upended by the revelations. Elijah's neighborhood buzzed with conversations about the story. Neighbors who barely spoke to him before now nodded in acknowledgement or stopped to ask questions. Some congratulated him, praising his bravery. Others warned him to be careful. "You're a hero, kid," Mr. Phillips, the owner of the corner store, said one afternoon. "But heroes have targets on their backs. Watch yourself." Elijah nodded, not entirely sure how to respond. He didn't feel like a hero. He had just done what felt right. Still, the warning lingered in his mind, especially as he noticed unfamiliar cars parked on his street or strangers walking by his house a little too often. At home, Elijah's mother was visibly anxious. She supported his actions wholeheartedly, but worried about the attention it was bringing. She couldn't ignore the subtle but growing signs of danger. "Elijah," she said one evening, sitting across from him at the dinner table, "you know I'm proud of you, right?" He nodded. "I know, Mom." She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "But this isn't just about us anymore. You've shaken up some very powerful people. They won't let this go easily." Elijah squeezed her hand, trying to reassure her. "We've got Sandra and Mr. Carter. They won't let anything happen to us." His mother's eyes softened, but the worry didn't leave her face. "Just promise me you'll be careful, okay? Promise me you'll think before you act." "I promise," Elijah said, though he wasn't entirely sure what being careful looked like in a situation like this. At the same time, Mr. Carter was dealing with his own fallout. His decision to bring the evidence forward had put him squarely in the crosshairs of the powerful figures exposed in the story. Anonymous threats had started coming in, emails, phone calls, even a letter left on his doorstep. "They're trying to scare us," Mr. Carter told Elijah during one of their meetings, "but we can't back down now. If we let them intimidate us, we lose everything we fought for." Elijah admired Mr. Carter's resolve, but he could see the strain it was taking on the older man. His shoulders were more hunched, his voice a bit shakier. The cost of speaking the truth was heavy, and it was clear they were all feeling it. Sandra, too, was on edge. The success of the story had elevated her status as a journalist, but it had also put a target on her back. She worked tirelessly, juggling interviews and coordinating with other journalists to keep the momentum of the story alive. Yet, behind the scenes, she was cautious, changing her routines, avoiding predictable patterns. "Elijah," she said during a phone call, "you've done more than most adults would ever dare to, but now you need to be smart. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. And in a marathon, you have to pace yourself." Elijah listened intently, her words resonating with him. He realized that while the immediate battle had been won, the war for justice was far from over. As days turned into weeks, the intensity of the fallout began to shift. While some of the individuals exposed by the story were arrested or forced to step down, others doubled down, using their resources to muddy the waters. They funded smear campaigns, spread misinformation, and painted themselves as victims of a witch hunt. Elijah found himself at the center of these attacks. Social media posts began popping up, questioning his motives and integrity. Some accused him of seeking fame, while others spun conspiracy theories about his involvement. It was overwhelming. He turned to Sandra for advice. "How do you deal with this?" he asked during a late-night phone call. "You focus on the truth," she said firmly. "The people who matter will see through the lies. But it's not easy, Elijah. You have to have thick skin." Elijah took her words to heart, but it didn't make the attacks any easier to endure. He leaned on his mother, Mr. Carter, and even his friends at school who stood by him despite the backlash. Their support reminded him why he had taken the risk in the first place, to do what was right. One afternoon, as Elijah was walking home, he noticed a small group of people gathered outside his house. At first he panicked, thinking they were protesters or reporters, but as he got closer, he realized they weren't there to cause trouble. A woman stepped forward, holding a young child by the hand. "Are you Elijah?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," he said cautiously. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for standing up for people like me and my family. Because of what you did, my husband's story is finally being heard." Elijah was taken aback. He hadn't expected to hear something like this, and it hit him deeply. He realized that the ripple effects of their actions were reaching people he'd never meet, changing lives in ways he couldn't fully grasp. As the group dispersed, Elijah sat on his porch, staring out at the street. For all the challenges and dangers, moments like that reminded him why he had taken the leap. He wasn't just fighting for himself or even for Mr. Carter. He was fighting for people like that woman and her child, for the countless others who had been silenced or ignored. The journey wasn't over, but Elijah was more determined than ever to see it through. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but he also knew he wasn't walking it alone. Together, with Sandra, Mr. Carter, and everyone else who believed in the truth, they were making a difference, one step at a time. As the weeks passed, the momentum of Elijah's story continued to grow. News outlets from across the globe picked up the story, each adding their own layers of analysis and commentary. It was no longer just about the small act of bravery Elijah had shown. It was about the massive wave of change his actions had triggered. Elijah found himself juggling school, media appearances, and the growing weight of his newfound responsibility. Though he had never sought fame, it seemed to have found him anyway. People stopped him on the street, calling him a hero. While some moments were humbling, others left him feeling overwhelmed. He was just a boy, someone who had done what he thought was right, yet the world seemed to see him as something much larger. One day, Elijah was invited to a town hall meeting in his community, a gathering meant to address the corruption and systemic issues that had been uncovered. He sat quietly at first, listening as speakers took turns sharing their stories of injustice. Many of them spoke of how the revelations had inspired them to come forward with their own truths. A man named Mr. Jefferson stood at the podium, his voice trembling with emotion. "If a young boy like Elijah can risk everything to do the right thing," he said, "then what excuse do we have? This is our community and it's time we take it back." The room erupted in applause, and Elijah felt a lump form in his throat. He had always believed in the importance of standing up for what was right, but seeing how his actions had inspired others filled him with a pride he hadn't known before. Not everyone, however, was supportive. The more attention the story received, the more resistance it faced from those who had benefited from the corruption. Threats against Elijah and his family became more direct. One evening, they found graffiti scrawled across their front door, "Stay quiet, or else." Elijah's mother was shaken, her worst fears seemingly realized. "This has gone too far," she said, pacing the living room. We need to call the police. We can't let them scare us, Elijah replied, his voice firm. He had seen too much to back down now. If we stay quiet, they win. His mother stopped, her eyes filled with both fear and admiration. You're so brave, Elijah, she said softly, but I need you to promise me you'll be careful. I can't lose you. I promise, Mom, Elijah said, though he wasn't sure how he could keep such a promise in the face of so much uncertainty. Meanwhile, Sandra and Mr. Carter were also feeling the pressure. Sandra's office had been broken into, her notes and recordings ransacked. She suspected it was a scare tactic, but it only strengthened her resolve. They're running scared, she told Elijah during one of their meetings. That means we're winning. Mr. Carter, however, was more cautious. We need to be strategic, he said. The more desperate they get, the more dangerous they'll become. Despite the risks, they pressed on, working tirelessly to ensure the truth couldn't be buried. They collaborated with other journalists, activists, and community leaders to create a network of support. Together, they were building a movement that couldn't be ignored. One evening, Elijah received an email from someone who claimed to have more evidence of wrongdoing by one of the key figures exposed in the story. The email included documents, photographs, and even video recordings. It was a goldmine of information, but it also came with a chilling message. They're watching me. I don't know how much longer I can stay safe. Elijah immediately forwarded the email to Sandra and Mr. Carter. They agreed to meet the whistleblower in a secure location. It was a tense meeting, held in a dimly lit parking garage late at night. The whistleblower, a young woman in her 20s, handed over a USB drive before disappearing into the shadows. The new evidence was explosive, implicating not just local officials but powerful figures on a national scale. Sandra and Mr. Carter worked around the clock to verify the information and prepare it for publication. Elijah stayed involved, determined to see it through. Finally, the day came when the new story was published. It was the tipping point, the moment when the movement reached critical mass. The evidence was undeniable, and even the most powerful figures couldn't escape accountability. Arrests were made, resignations tendered, and reforms initiated. Elijah watched it all unfold, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over him. The fight wasn't over, but they had won a major battle. More importantly, they had shown the world what could happen when ordinary people stood up for what was right. For the first time in weeks, Elijah allowed himself to breathe. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and danger, but he had come out stronger on the other side. And though the road ahead was still long, he knew he wouldn't walk it alone. Together, they had made history, and Elijah was just getting started. The dust from the storm Elijah had stirred was settling, but the ripples of his actions were only beginning to show their true impact. The revelations sparked by his bravery weren't just shaking up corrupt officials. They were awakening something long dormant within the community. In the weeks following the publication of the latest evidence, the streets of Elijah's neighborhood began to change. People who had once turned a blind eye to the injustices around them were now finding their voices. Community centers, once half empty and underfunded, were bustling with activity. Meetings were held regularly, and people from all walks of life showed up, ready to contribute to a collective vision for a better future. For the first time, Elijah saw hope shining brightly in the eyes of his neighbors. Mrs. Patel, who owned the small grocery store on the corner, started offering free supplies to children who came from families struggling to make ends meet. Mr. Williams, the retired carpenter, volunteered to repair run-down playgrounds and fix broken fences around the community. Elijah's actions had lit a spark, but the people were fanning it into a flame. One of the most significant changes came from the youth in the neighborhood. Inspired by Elijah's courage, kids and teenagers began to form their own groups to tackle issues they saw around them. From organizing cleanups to running after-school programs, they showed the kind of energy and determination that no one had expected. "Elijah, you've made us realize we can do more," said a girl named Maya, one of the leaders of a youth group. "We've been waiting for someone to lead the way, and you showed us we don't have to wait anymore." Elijah felt a swell of pride. He had never thought of himself as a leader, but seeing the difference he had made filled him with gratitude and purpose. "It's all of us," he told her. "We're stronger together." Amid the hope and change, challenges still remained. Not everyone was ready to embrace the new wave of activism. Some residents felt it was a waste of time, while others feared the backlash from those in power. One evening, as Elijah and his mother attended a town meeting, an older man named Mr. Thompson stood up to speak. His face was lined with years of hard work, and his voice was tinged with skepticism. "This is all well and good," he began, "but we've seen movements like this before. They start strong, but when the going gets tough, people back down. What's different this time?" The room fell silent and all eyes turned to Elijah. He stood up slowly, his heart pounding. He wasn't used to public speaking, but he knew this was a moment that mattered. "What's different," he began, his voice steady, "is that we're not waiting for someone else to fix things. We're doing it ourselves. And yeah, it's going to be hard, and there will be setbacks. But if we don't fight for our community, who will? I don't have all the answers, but I know this. If we stand together, we can make this work." The room erupted into applause, and Mr. Thompson nodded, a small smile breaking through his stern expression. The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose. Plans were made to address housing issues, improve local schools, and create more opportunities for young people. Elijah's voice had become a rallying cry, and the community was determined to keep moving forward. One day, Elijah and his mother were walking home from the market when they noticed something different about their street. Where graffiti once covered the walls, there was now a mural, a vibrant, colorful depiction of the neighborhood, with Elijah standing at its center surrounded by smiling faces. The artist, a local named Jamal, stepped back to admire his work. "This is for you, Elijah," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You reminded us what this place can be." Elijah stared at the mural, his eyes wide with awe. "It's not just me," he said softly. "It's all of us." His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her face glowing with pride. "You've done something incredible, Elijah. You've shown people that one voice can make a difference." As the sun set that evening, Elijah sat on the steps of his home, watching the kids play in the street. The sounds of laughter and chatter filled the air, a stark contrast to the fear and silence that had once dominated the neighborhood. He knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt certain they were on the right path. And as he looked at the mural, he couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just his story anymore. It was the story of a community coming alive, standing together, and refusing to back down. Together, they were unstoppable. Elijah's story serves as a powerful reminder that true bravery isn't about having superpowers or extraordinary abilities. It's about the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or risky. Elijah didn't have guarantees. He didn't know how things would turn out, but he chose to act, driven by his principles and an unshakable belief in doing the right thing. His bravery wasn't just a fleeting moment. It sparked a ripple effect. His small act of standing up for a stranger inspired a community to reevaluate their biases and assumptions, to come together in support of justice, and to embrace the values of kindness and unity. Elijah's actions remind us all that even the smallest voices can ignite significant change, proving that it's not about how big or strong you are, but how much heart you have. At the heart of this tale is a lesson for us all. In a world that often feels divided and uncertain, bravery and kindness are the bridges that connect us. They remind us of our shared humanity and the power we hold to make the world a better place, one act at a time. Elijah's story doesn't end here, and neither does its impact. It challenges each of us to reflect on our own lives. What would you do in Elijah's shoes? Would you have the courage to stand up for someone in need? Would you step forward, even if the path ahead seemed unclear? We believe in the extraordinary power of these stories to inspire and transform. If Elijah's journey moved you, let it be a spark for action in your own life. Don't underestimate the power of your choices. Every decision to stand up, speak out, or lend a helping hand has the potential to create a ripple effect of its own. Thank you for watching. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know, what would you do in Elijah's shoes? And stay tuned for more stories that uncover the courage, compassion, and resilience within us all. Until next time, keep believing in the power of kindness. It just might change the world. This might change the world. This might change